Hello and welcome to the Renegade Report. I am Rahman, and I'm afraid I have no idea where Jonathan is. Hopefully, he will join me soon. I've sent him the invitation. Oh, wait, there we go. He'll actually join us in 2 minutes' time. So, first of all, thank you all for joining in. Good to have you here. Um, yeah, let me know what you think. Other than the inauguration and the exemplary paratrooper, slamming into a pole. Let me know what pressing issues you want to discuss. I have a few on my plate here, but I'd rather wait for Jonathan to join me, which he said will be 2 minutes from now. So let me see here. So the EU elections, yes, we're going to discuss this with when Jonathan joins us. I think the EU elections represent the plurality of Europe to a stark degree. The problem with the EU essentially is that it sort of wants to strip away independence of states, independence of strip away independent cultures, independent ways of doing things, and have a sort of monoculture, globalized, well, a European system of laws that really, is not working, I'm afraid. I think people like Europe and the EU for peace and stability in Europe. I think the economic policy destroys that, especially at the euro and things like that. So it's interesting that the EU now has more Eurosceptics in parliament than any other form of ideology. And that says quite a few things. Predominantly in England, for example, it's interesting to note that Brexit Party, which is 6 weeks old, with no real manifesto, with no real policy, they just wanted to deliver Brexit, won most of the votes, like 32% of the votes or something went to Brexit. They're the largest party in the EU Parliament. That is quite an achievement. And I keep saying, if you look at my Twitter, Nigel Farage is probably the best politician since Thatcher, I would argue, quite easily. The man has done many things. Before him, if you spoke about nationalism in England and nationalism in Europe generally, it was very much racially tinged. There's like the whites in, everyone outside of Europe out, a lot of racial epithets and things like that. And he managed to forge a nationalism that, sidestepped all of those moral issues. He says, Britain for the British. We want our own laws. We want our own immigration policy. We want Parliament to be accountable to the people through voting. And he's done a remarkable job. And this shows because his previous party, UKIP, was trounced in the polls. Whereas before it was the largest party in the EU, if I'm not mistaken. And Jonathan has arrived.
I have indeed, Ramon.
Welcome. Sorry, I'm really live. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I see. You just don't wait anymore, eh?
I went live before you sent me a message, by the way. So yes.
Oh, that's fine. Don't worry. I'm used to it.
Oh, you want to talk? You control the bloody what's it called? The mixing board and cut me off.
Have the mute button, unfortunately.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Welcome, Jonathan. So we are live, and I was just talking about the EU elections and the strange fact that EU Parliament is dominated by Eurosceptic parties.
Well, yes, Eurosceptic, and I think an important factor to note is that they're not all the same. So they all dislike the EU. Some are left, some are right. They all have varying opinions on things. I saw some interesting views on social media today in this regard. Russ Lamberti had some good points to make with regards to the sort of varying opinions across these parties, the different types of nationalism, their views on what would make their countries the best, and certainly nothing that looks like a cohesive union. And then another account that I follow, Greg Connolly, talking about how the EU is essentially what Germany tried to set up post World War One, and with Germany as a central power running the whole of Europe, because of course they know best. That was the Kaiser's sort of plan for Germany, and I think that's largely true. I think Germany has very much defended the EU. I think they get the most out of it. Certainly, the currency changes and everything affected them the least of most of the countries, and it's probably them and France in terms of the elites in France who are least wanting to leave the EU. But if you look at the average
Sorry,
Joe,
Jonathan, just interrupt. Just increase your volume a little bit. You're a little bit soft.
oh, okay, no worries. I'm going to put in some headphones now, and hopefully that'll solve the problem.
All right, no worries at all. Yeah, no, it's interesting because it seems like the Greens, which are like the radical left, did very well, and then the so-called radical right, like the Brexit Party, which is not a radical right to me or to most reasonable people, did very well as well. But also, if you look at the left did very well in Spain, the right did very well in Poland. So it really is a sort of the mainstream is not doing well. But the ones on what they would call the fringes, the populists, because if we don't like something, we call it populists. They do very well, and I mean, what do you think of that? Is it about centrism being dead, or is it about people understanding that centrism actually doesn't do much? Essentially,
I just think we've lost touch with what the average person actually wants, and the sort of general view is that what is best for the world is actually quite a leftist position. It's left a lot of people behind. It's pushed, as we've discussed on the show before, it's pushed a lot of people who used to be on the left towards what would now be considered the right, but really isn't the right at all. The fact that you have Labour people in the working class in Britain, certainly working class people across Italy, countries like Hungary, Poland, in France with the protests there. These are people who traditionally vote for Jeremy Corbyn-like parties, Bernie Sanders-like parties, parties that emanate from deep leftist views, from essentially wanting to do similar things to what the Soviet Union did. And that's who they traditionally voted for, but they've moved so far from any semblance of what those people identify with, that we're now seeing this weird merging of the right, the left, in terms of getting together and believing that their best interests are not served by a small elite group of people who think they know best.
yeah, I think that's some element of it, but I also think that there's obviously a class problem here. I think elitism is a real thing in Europe. It's actually much more difficult to be part of the elite in Europe than in America, because in America, it actually changes quite a lot, especially economically. People can become billionaires literally like within a year or two. In Europe, it's far more difficult. So I think the elite have remained fairly constant in Europe for the past few decades, post World War II, I would suggest. And then if you go to the correct schools, you go to the correct military academies, you go into politics after that, and then you sort of, get immersed into this bubble-like worldview where it's sort of you're expected, to just be part of the EU. It's just common sense, guys. It's just common sense that we need our bananas to be a certain shape and a certain size, and the EU must, have a decree about the length of bananas generally. And I think, people on the ground who see like their petrol price increases because of EU regulations, they see their fishing die because of EU regulations, they see subsidies, their money being sent to like French farmers instead of, people in their neighborhood. And I think after a while, people will be like, well, I'm actually not being represented at all in politics, and especially not in the EU. So I'm going to vote for people who are anti-EU. And I think that makes the most common sense. And I think immigration played a huge role in it. Not because people are racist, but people hate change, especially fast change, especially fast demographic change.
Yeah, I'm not even convinced of the change issue. I think there's this it's a colliding of this sort of cultural war that's going on, which is the belief that it's not only about change, it's that a lot of what you stand for, or how you've lived your life, or how your parents lived their lives, how you worshipped, or how your family has for generations, how you view basic tenets of existence, be it around family, be it around children, be it around spending your money. There's a sort of attack on all of this stuff, and so I think there's just a round rejection of all of this, and it keeps happening, and no one seems to get the message. Brexit the first time around was essentially this. Yes, there are real issues. There are, the fact that you can't fish properly in Britain because those rules are made for the Nordic states, not for British fishing, for example. Forestry, I think, similar problems. Issues around emissions as well, which work in some countries, don't in others. So there are real things like that, but there's also this undercurrent of other stuff going on. This push towards, our countries aren't growing, so we need to repopulate our countries, so what we're going to do is we're going to just import people who don't believe the way we, excuse my voice, by the way, don't believe the way we live our lives. Is the way to live lives. So we're just going to import these people and hope it all turns out well, and just ignore the fact that the countries they're coming from haven't turned out well, and that's absolutely got to do with the values and the positions of the society, and so there's just a round rejection, I think, of both policy. And those who are interested enough to actually follow the policy and understand it, but I also think there's just a rejection of the general culture.
Yeah, and my last word on this, I watched BBC Hard Talk with Matteo Salvini. He's the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, and he's part of the League, which used to be it's a secessionist federalist movement that wanted to secede the north of Italy. So think of it like sort of like the K Party of Italy in essence. And now they've in coalition, they've gained power in 2018, I believe it was, last year. And Stephen Sacco, the host of Hard Talk, kept pressing Salvini on immigration. He's like, but the EU rules dictate that if people come, and they land on your beach, you have to take care of them. And Salvini says, well, yes, but if you read the rules, the EU is supposed to help us take care of them. So far, they haven't. So we're just not allowing people into our ports. And the more we don't allow people in, the less people actually travel to us, and the less people die in the Mediterranean Sea. And like that's his fundamental view of immigration, and it's a perfectly sound and valid view of immigration, in essence. And the host of the BBC talk show, the globalist host, like could not just understand that. It was all about rules and procedures rather than what works for Italy. And there was a direct distinction between the two worldviews.
Well, immigration is such a defining issue of this split across the world, because I think that most people are able to understand common sense immigration law. Sure, there are those who say it should be open borders, and whether they like it or not, they're in a minority. There's those who say completely close borders, and I think those people are also in a minority. I think the majority of people accept that immigration into countries is good, but you have to be getting product that's good in the human capital sense. And so for many years, it's just been understood if you want to go to a country like Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, any of the Western world, the United States included, you need to present yourself. You need to make a case for yourself. And then they would have a look at you and essentially, almost like a job interview, decide if you were going to be good for their country. Most people see that as a reasonable way to allow people to immigrate. And unfortunately, instead of just continuing to be kind of common sense on that. I mean, the abortion debate is another area where this has gone completely off the rails. So people were common sense for probably 3 decades on this, where they were like, yeah, you apply. If you have the correct qualifications or a skill that country needs, you get in, you behave the way they want you to behave, and you become one of them rather than being where you've come from. And most people agreed that was a completely reasonable, logical way to approach it. If you look at what's happening in the United States, you've got large sections of the Democratic Party saying that the southern border with Mexico should be an open border. that people should be able to cross from South America straight into the United States, that these people should have voting rights. This is not a fringe position at all. You've got people running for the presidential candidacy of the Democratic Party who are saying this kind of stuff. And I don't think they realize that other than the journalists who sort of virtue signal and will signal boost them in the likes of the New York Times, other than them, the average person on the street thinks they're insane.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Joe Wentz in the comments, I mean, put up a fairly good points. Is that the rush of refugees to Europe was basically the consequence of war in Libya. That is true to some extent. Don't get me wrong, but based on the statistics, most of the people were not fleeing war at all. They were from Gambia, Ivory Coast, Morocco, Algeria. I think about 85% of them were not from war zones. So these are what we call economic, not refugees, economic immigrants. They moving for economic reasons, not as refugees, so to speak. So the war in Libya has an effect, but not to the extent that every single immigrant is a refugee or illegal immigrant is a refugee at all. Let's talk about Farage just very quickly. Can he actually solve Brexit through the EU, though? I don't know if that's possible, but I don't know the intricacies of the system that well.
Yeah, I've actually been trying to get a guest on the show to talk about this, and hopefully we'll have someone, a British person on soon who has a lot more insight into this. But my understanding is essentially what seems to be happening now is Farage is pushing for, or Farage, sorry, I always get the pronunciation incorrect, is pushing for a hard Brexit, which is essentially WTO rules. This is not a right wing. This is not weird. If you had told someone 30 years ago that you were a country and you were looking to start trade based on the World Trade Organization rules, which are agreed upon by about 180 nations, as far as I understand, that's not an unreasonable position to take. That's, I think, where they're going with it at the moment. I don't see how you get to a deal with the EU. The EU does not want to let go of Britain. The EU knows that once Britain is let go, they are fundamentally weaker as an organization, not just because Britain has left, but because someone has left. And if someone leaves, there are many opportunities for others to leave, and that will be Portugal, Italy, Poland, you name them.
Yeah, no, it will create a precedent. But there was a great comedy skit, and I don't know who it is. He spoke about Brexit, and it basically, imagine you and 4 friends go to the Burger King, and then when you get there, you order the burgers, 4 burgers, and then after 5 minutes, 3 of your friends say, "Oh, we don't really feel like being here. Let's go." So you say, "Fine." You go to the manager. "Can we just cancel our order and go?" He says, "No, you can't." "Oh, okay. So what do you need to do to go?" "Well, first of all, we're going to negotiate for 2 years, and then just before you leave, you must pay me £40 billion, and not have your burgers either." And there was a long skit, about 10 minutes, about the Brexit negotiations through stand-up comedy. It was phenomenal. But I will need to see that. Next PM for Britain, who do you want? I want Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg. I'll be happy with any of those.
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think Boris Johnson has a lot of problems because he's got baggage. So I quite like Boris Johnson, but there's a lot of baggage that comes with him. He hasn't even really put his foot forward that much yet, and he's already being roundly attacked pretty much everywhere he goes. Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think, would be excellent. I'm not sure the Conservative Party is ready to go there. They've got a few others. I'm going to forget. Sajiv. I'm going to fuck this name up. But
Sajid, someone, yes, I know.
Yeah, he's also quite good. Very level-headed, pro-Brexit. Very typical Tory of 5-6 years ago before they lost their minds. So I'm not really sure. My concern is I'm not sure what's left of the Conservative Party come the next general elections if they try to continue this Theresa May like half
appeasement.
exactly, half
Stench
in, half
of
out.
appeasement, as Margaret Thatcher always says. I smell the stench of appeasement in the air. Oh, but there's another one, Dominic Raab, who called feminists obnoxious bigots. So he's really cool. I really like him. I know nothing about him, and he defended himself in public for after uttering that statement. So there we go. Dominic Raab, Boris Johnson. What's his name? Sajid Javid. There we go.
Thank you. There we go.
Sorry,
Sorry,
it's a
sorry
bit,
for
it's a bit of
scratching
a,
that up.
it's a bit of
The
a
tongue
exotic
twister.
name. Yeah, sorry, especially for an Arab like me. That is very Oriental.
I mean, it is also just comical as well that, you know, given the left's obsession with identity politics, it's always the right who ends up having candidates who are actually fulfill diversity criteria. Not that the right gives a shit, but it's always the right who ends up having females in power. It's always the right who ends up giving people of color, and I hate using that term, but people of color, their opportunity, their stab at the positions. It's never the left. The left is made up of Jeremy Corbyn, Beto O'Rourke, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders.
Hey, but they have a Native American in Elizabeth Warren, so
yeah, that is true. The Native American, 0.004%, correct.
So okay, that's the EU election's done. I think the EU's in a precarious position. More Eurosceptics in Parliament than ever before. It's going to be very interesting going forward. But I don't think the EU Parliament actually has that much power compared to the Commission and the other things. There's quite a few bodies in the EU. So I've been reading a book which I think everyone who listens to us should read. It's called The New Right by Michael Mellis. I'm about halfway through, and it is absolutely a phenomenal piece of investigative journalism. So Michael Mellis is a sort of Ayn Rand anarchist libertarian, born in the Soviet Union, moved to America at the age of 2 or 3, and now he just doesn't give a shit, and he's a troll on Twitter, like a professional troll. Got a good podcast, and he writes very well. And I mean, it's difficult to talk about it if you haven't read it, but just for people listening and people watching, The New Right by Michael Mellis, top-notch book about the origins of the new right, which is not, the Republicans and the Democrats. It's something completely sort of fringe. And he says to define these people in universal terms is very, very difficult. Some are racists, some are Nazis, some are like crypto transhumanists. The thing that unites them is they are all united against progressivism, and therefore they are sort of united against democracy. Because the main idea in the book and from the new rights perspective is that democracy is literally progressivism at play all the time. So they actually want monarchy back. But it's a fascinating book, and I think everyone should read it. I doubt you've read it, John, as yet.
No, not as yet, not for a little while. Unfortunately, schedule does not allow. But look, Michael Mellis, I much prefer his writing, frankly, to anything else he does. An interesting guy, very interesting views. Ruben had him on a while back, so and recently, I think.
Last week, last week, Ruben Report, and I don't like Dave Rubin at all, but last week, Michael Mellis spoke for almost like an hour and a half because Ruben couldn't interrupt, and it gives a fair outline of the book. So that's my recommendation for the week. Now, on to something a bit more closer to home. Helen Zille has been unleashed. She destroyed Twitter last weekend, and she destroyed the DA this past weekend, rather, by writing a column where she says she's guilty of wanting to transform the DA along racial lines, and that backfired spectacularly, and she takes responsibility for it. And I was reading it, and I said, I can't last remember when a politician took responsibility for something. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I think the interesting part of that column is, Helen Zille reflecting on what she was trying to do and where it all went wrong. In fairness, she does need to take some flack because she was criticized for doing exactly what she did at the time, and many people warned her that this may be the way it would go. But as you say, it is quite refreshing to see a politician say, this is what I did, this was the intention, this is what actually ended up happening. This is why I think it happened, and yeah, it was a big mistake, and it's caused a lot of damage.
But
And
here's,
Mhm.
sorry, here's the thing I don't really understand. Did they want to transform the party to get more votes, or were they tired of being called the so-called white party? That wasn't very clear from the column. But what was
Mm.
very clear from the column is how pervasive the ANC hegemony of racial nationalism really is, where the main opposition party thinks the ANC is correct when they label us the whites only party. Like, for me, that was the most obvious thing, that how at that time, and it will even to this day, the DA really cannot define itself by its own principles. And I don't think it ever will at this stage. But that was the interesting part. The ANC actually created the drama within the DA that sort of destroyed.
Although Helen does make it quite clear that the DA chose to play that game. And that's what she cites as the main sort of flaw, that the transformation she felt was a necessary intervention. So, putting Musi Maimane into power, which she essentially did, way too young, in my opinion, way too inexperienced. But she felt that that was necessary, propping up certain people over others based on specific sort of transformation criteria. She felt that that was justified as well. And then she laments the fact that the DA went on to play the ANC race narrative. But the problem is the minute she uses the word transformation, the reality is she is playing the ANC race narrative. And over and above that, I'm not sure what you could expect to happen from a guy who's in his mid 30s, who essentially has very little political training of any substance, any great knowledge in this particular field, and then a whole bunch of UCT grads who pull in with their social justice training. I don't know where else you think that would end up going. But look, Helen didn't potentially see the amount of danger, or she thought it could be thwarted. She was wrong, and it's interesting to see what's happening. Look, this is also a shot across the bow of the DA, because Helen is turning around and going. She's pulling the pieces apart of the DA and saying, these are issues you have in your party, and the DA will either choose to address them or they won't. As we've seen previously, the chances are they don't.
Yeah, no, it looks like the cost of doubling down is less than the cost of changing. But what is interesting about that column was when she said the more they transformed, the shriller the cries of racism became. Because now, Musi is a black puppet for white faces and that sort of shit as well. And that is a fundamental mistake you make when dealing with, a well-seasoned and well-trained opposition party like the ANC, or a governing party in this stage. If you exceed or accept one of their points, they will utterly destroy you with that point, because you've already moved away towards them. They've already strategically defined you the way they want you to find you. And then as soon as you do that, they know they have you in a trap, and they will just double down on the attack. And that has been extremely powerful, I think. And I think the DA sort of has PTSD, from the past 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think, it's been said on the show before, don't play on the opposition's wicket. And
Yeah.
and the DA constantly makes that error of playing on the other team's wicket. But look, this is a feature of the left. If the right wins you over, if you watching the Renegade Report or listening to the Renegade Report for the first time, and we make a particularly good point, and you've always been quite left on immigration, for example, and we seem to be making a good point, and you decide, I actually agree with that, and we perhaps we make a few other good points, and you decide, I actually don't think I'm on the left anymore. I'm in the center, or I'm on the right. It's funny. We're not going to try and turn you into authoritarian Nazis. We're never going to push you there. But the left will never accept that your movement towards the left in some small way is enough. This is why there is literally the saying, the left eats its own. And it's true, there isn't the saying the right eats its own, because it doesn't really. Just doesn't generally happen. And so The problem is when you surrender that ground, it'll never be enough. Today, if you accept one particular small leftist position, it won't be enough, because next week you'll need to accept a more radical position. Otherwise, you'll be thrown out of the group.
Yeah, I think, but also, I mean, even for us, Jonathan, I think I want to sort of make a point generally on the podcast and elsewhere that to me, left and right are becoming obsolete as political terms, because in the New Right, the book that I'm reading now, Michael Malice makes the point that conservatism is actually progressivism driving at the speed limit. And he makes the point, National Review in 1993 made gay marriage a comparison with gay marriage and necrophilia. He says, well, if you can marry a man and another man, what prevents people from marrying a corpse and having sex with it? 2017, the conservative case for gay marriage in the exact same newspaper, and his argument, and this is very persuasive, Malice said the conservatives actually don't have any real values as such. It actually evolves anyway. That's why democracy is actually progressivism, because the conservative values don't actually exist in any meaningful way. They just take the values presently, realign them to 10, 15 years in the past, but sooner or later, the conservatives of 20 years ago become the left of today, essentially. So I think for us, left and right does not make a clear distinction. I think we should talk about values and principles and things like that far more than political ideologies and political spectrums.
Yeah, the problem with doing that and saying, well, we don't believe in the spectrum and the spectrum doesn't exist any longer, is that the majority of people know the spectrum and they don't know anything else. And it's used as a quick marker of understanding. So if someone says, this is why the media does this all the time, where they will say something like, well, far right podcaster Ramon Kabanak, or last week gay podcaster Ramon Kabanak, that's why they use those markers, because those markers to the average person in the street very easily tells them something, and so they need to say very little more in terms of description of the person. And so I hear you, and I think this has been going on for a long time in terms of what is the right, what is the left. Does this stuff make any sense anymore? It doesn't really seem to. But I think dispensing with the terms completely on sort of this principles level doesn't really work when speaking to the general population, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you have an opinion about a so-called, group of people that doesn't actually exist, as Jason Werbeloff accurately said on our podcast 2 weeks ago, it's fair in some ways, but we must be fair with what we say about them, if that makes sense. We must be more accurate. So if you speak to, I've spoken to Marxists on this, and the Marxists hate the postmodernists, and they hate, and they actually, get in line more with libertarians these days, individualism, class, free speech, guns, things like that. Because if you read Marxism, it's quite similar. I mean, in terms of the freedom of the press, people having the right to own guns, people fighting for political power and economic power as the exploited. If you speak to a libertarian and a Marxist, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, the different ideologies, true, but there's a lot of overlap. So you find a lot of Marxists like Brendan O'Neill, who had at the show, talking to libertarians and disagreeing with them on censorship of tech industry, not so much censorship of the states. So they agree on a lot of things and they disagree on a lot of things too. But there's far more overlapping of Marxists, real Marxists and libertarians than one would think.
I wouldn't call them real Marxists. I'd call them revisionist Marxists. There's this lovely movement that's happening in that sort of space, in the Marxist sort of space, where there's this claim that Marxism actually wasn't how it was interpreted by the Bolsheviks, and it wasn't how it was interpreted by Lenin and Stalin, etc., etc. Actually, Marxism was a much more progressive, peaceful, uninterfering belief and sort of value system, and all it really wanted to do was point out the issues with the class system, and by pointing them out to bring some sort of better equality.
Are you
There's
sure
a
you're
lot
not
of revisionist
strawmanning
history.
Marxists?
Sorry?
Are you sure you're not strawmanning Marxists? Something that we were just speaking about not doing.
No, I don't think I'm strawmanning Marxists. I think you can be nice to the Marxists. I don't like Marxists. If you tell me you're a Marxist and you really believe in all that stuff, then I think you're not as good about as good a person as someone who says I'm a Nazi and I really believe in all that stuff. There's enough history that is not a straw man to show that Marxism is one of the worst things to happen to humanity in all time. Now, if you want to reframe it and you want to say, well, we're in the 21st century, and actually we went back and reread Marx and we interpreted a different way to how a whole bunch of brutal leaders and their regimes interpreted it, fine, we can perhaps have a discussion. But then you need to acknowledge that the one interpretation of this particular ideology led to 150 years of absolute chaos and genocide and murder and some of the worst things that have ever happened to humanity. And you don't get to sit in 2019 and say, no, I'm a real Marxist. I'm not like those other Marxists. They're not the real ones. Sorry, you don't get to say the dead Marxists aren't Marxists and you are.
No, I understand, but I mean, I can understand Marxists who are Marxists and love to discuss what it's about and acknowledge that it may not work in reality. I think those are reasonable Marxists. I think if they think that the values and the principles of Marxism are worth debating, worth discussing, but without actually implementing it, consensually in small communities, yeah, cool, go ahead. I mean, if in my anarchist utopia, you would have different societies hopefully trading with each other, but these societies could be Marxist, could be fascist, could be liberal, could be ethnic, could be traditional, paleo, whatever you want.
In your anarchist utopia, my community massacres and executes all the Marxists in 3 days, and no one can do anything about it because it's an anarchy.
Well, I mean, the Marxists will have to pay for security, so yeah, they can get along very well. But I mean, anarchy is the end result of Marxism. If you read your Marx correctly, that's exactly what he wanted. It's true. True.
All right. There was a question on. Do you want to carry on talking about Zille? I think we've covered her.
I think we've covered it. I mean, I think personally, for me, Gwen's gone, Helen is gone, Jonathan Mokes is gone from the DA, the head of elections. I didn't know much about him before, but anyway, he's gone. I see a lot of institutional dysfunction there, a lot of competence stripped away. It's now or never for the liberals of the party to take control. In the next,
I think what's concerning is
if that doesn't happen, it's going to be Democrats 2.0 in South Africa, and they're going to be like, the transgenderism of the MPs are a real important issue, and then they've fucking lost completely.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that came out after the elections, or was shown after the elections, was sure, Gwen leaves, Helen leaves, Jonathan Mokes, which I don't think is a great loss, but the reality is there hasn't been much introspection from their side. We've heard now from Helen Zille. There've been a couple of comments here and there, but much of the leadership has shown arrogance. And Solly Malatsi has been arrogant. James Self, in the little that he said, seems to have been quite arrogant. They're sort of going, no, we haven't done anything wrong here. It's the people. The people are wrong. So if they're going to carry on with that, I think that they're ultimately a losing and a shrinking party. And I don't know how in a country like South Africa you can truly think that you try to be like the ANC and actually are going to get more votes than them at the polls. It's just never going to happen. You're not a liberation party. You don't have an identity in people's lives. And unless you're offering something really different, which people can believe in, they're not voting for you.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, a question from the comments here. It's about democracy and IQ, but I want to talk about democracy generally speaking. I mean, can democracy work in theory? And the book I'm reading, The New Right, actually says even in theory it doesn't bloody well work. Because what is democracy? One man, one vote. Everyone has equal say. But even in the most democratic form of democracy, which is this town hall meeting, there's still an agenda, there's still time limits, there's still rules about who can speak about what, generally speaking. So there's actually a very strong case that democracy cannot work at all, irrespective of IQ, culture, whatever the case might be, because it is actually, it doesn't even work in theory, let alone in practice.
Yeah, I mean, this becomes one of those sort of philosophical type of arguments where, you say groups don't exist, and then you go out for beer with a group of your friends. Um, and so it's the same for democracy. Democracy can't work, and it doesn't work, and whatever. Except we keep having these democratic elections all over the world. Um, they sort of work. Yeah, there are problems. Yeah, it's the Winston Churchill quote. It's the worst. It's the worst system except for all the others.
Yeah, but
Um,
Jonathan, I mean, people go to church every Sunday. They feel better after it. It works. They have good lunches with their family on a Sunday after church. It feels really good. They speak to the priest. They give a little bit of tithe or whatever it's called, a tithe to the church. They feel good. And then by Friday, they feel disillusioned. They feel bad. They've sinned. Then they go back on Sunday, and the cycle repeats. So, I mean, the fact that the symbols and the rituals of a democracy happen, in ways that we can see. It doesn't mean that democracy is actually happening. It's just symbols. It's just rituals. It's just behavior. It doesn't mean that that thing actually exists.
Yeah, but this is a very highfalutin kind of opinion, and I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong, but it's like saying my car doesn't actually drive. All that actually happens is there's small explosions that happen within a chamber. That chamber produces pressure, and that pressure drives a motor, and that motor gets me down the road. But I'm not actually, driving my car. Sure, that's correct. Well done. You've broken it down into the little bits, and you've sort of explained why actually what you thought was happening wasn't really happening, and it happens in all these other little ways. But who cares? Because what point have you made? People are still getting into their car and driving to work, and so fine. If democracy doesn't work and it doesn't exist and it's not real and it can't work in theory or in practice, great. Except, as I said, you have all these countries who run democracies to some extent. Personally, I like the republic model, but it's still run on a semi-democratic basis. And and if you're going to say it doesn't exist or it doesn't work, cool. But what are we doing then? What are we doing in your world? I suppose, Ramon, it's like, well, we stop doing all of it tomorrow, and then we just live in our own communities, and everyone's just shon and ah, and you build the roads, and I put up the street lights.
Well, I mean, I don't think it will happen that way. But I mean, you say that now because that's just the way it is. But I mean, Jonathan, if there was slavery, would you be against it? I mean, if 99% of the world said the world was flat, would you be like, no, it's actually round? You're like sort of one of those people that just accept things because it's difficult to talk about or we are not persuasive enough. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it.
We can talk about it. I think that's a bit of a fallacious argument. I don't think defending the fact that the democracy does exist, it can be seen to be working to some extent in multiple examples all over the show over decades of time. I don't think that's comparable to flat Earth, which cannot be proven in any way whatsoever. So no, I don't. I don't think that's a fair argument. I think it's fine if you want to say there's no real such thing as democracy, or democracy isn't working, or democracy doesn't exist, or whatever. That's great, and we can have the conversation, and we can be very philosophical about it, and we can go down these rabbit holes for hours, as Jason can prove, and very interestingly so. I can chat with someone like Jason for several hours, but at the same time, there's a practical component. That was one of the comments from that podcast was,
Hmm.
people saying, yeah, I think Jason's right, actually. I don't think there are groups. I think they're just, made up. But I'm still going to go to my church, and I'm still going to call it a church group, and I'm still going to see my friends who are a group. And when there's a group marching and they're wearing red t-shirts and says EFF, I'm still going to think that's a group of EFF people. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's great to have these sort of thoughtful ideas and conversations, but there's a reality to deal with, and it's fine. You don't have to deal in that reality, but then you must get used to losing until you can institute your reality.
Right. Well, I mean, here's my definition of democracy: rival gangs using fallacious rules that suggest that we have power over them when we actually don't, and then when the rival gang wins the vote, they take over the state and use it for their benefit. Now, if you read Hans Hermann Hoppe, who is a great anarchist philosopher, he advocates monarchy. Because I see Dylan and Scott in the comments here talk about monarchy, and his argument for monarchy was monarchy is about ensuring that the monarch can keep title and power for generations. The problem with democracy is actually the limited amount of time that you have power. So democratic governments are actually far more reckless and will use their power recklessly because they don't actually have that much time to actually stay in power due to the internal contradictions of the system. Whereas a monarch would want generational passing of power, so to speak. So he says monarchy actually is a far better system than democracy, and there's a lot of truth to that. And what is also interesting about monarchy, the monarch is actually a lot more accountable to the people he lords over. And history has shown you cut off the monarch's head if he does something really wrong. In democracy, what, you have to wait a few years to vote them out until the next group of elites come in? Yeah, that's the difficult part, isn't it?
The issue with monarchy is it's the same as the dictator, right? So you either get benevolent or you get brutal, and monarchy is no different. I think I think we're in an age where we haven't had really true monarchs of major empires for a long time now. We forget that some monarchs were lovely people, and some monarchs were not. And in fact, most monarchs were not lovely people. Most monarchs were the type of folk who walked into your village and took all the 18-year-old boys and took them off, or the 16-year-old boys, or whatever old they wanted fighting men to be, and took them off to war to conquer new places. And sometimes it worked out, and sometimes it didn't.
Thankfully, conscription never happened under democracy.
Conscription does happen under democracy, but as far as I can tell, forced conscription not for the last, what, Ramon, about 50 years anywhere in the Western world?
20 years.
Forced conscription, it's not more. Forced conscription, the last time that happened was Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it still happens in Switzerland and Israel to this day.
Oh, okay, yeah. So like, those are fringe countries. It happens.
Israel's a fringe country.
It is a fringe country. There's 8 million, 9 million people in Israel. How's that a major country?
Well, I mean, it's a democracy.
It's 14 kilometers wide at one point.
No, but you're proving my point. In democracy, it's still forced conscription. So your argument against monarchy can be used against democracy too.
It can. So well done. There's 2 countries that have forced conscription to prove your point, and 98 countries that don't have forced conscription to prove my point.
But I think any argument against monarchy can be used against democracy, because essentially it's the same thing except less accountability under democracy.
Sure, and I'm going to use cars as an example. Any argument about reliability can be used against one brand or another brand, but one brand may be more reliable. Democracy is more reliable than monarchy, most likely.
More reliable for what?
For human prosperity.
Oh, weird thing. Well, how come constitutional monarchies are often the best places in the world to live? If you think of the European countries, if you think of the Far East, Thailand's a monarchy.
Well, because they've taken power away from the monarchs.
No, but it's interesting. Isn't that a weird thing, though? Constitutional monarchies are the best countries to live in. Don't you find that a bit strange? Why is that?
Yeah, but it takes away from your monarch argument. We can talk about that, but it takes away from your monarch argument because those monarchs don't really exert any power.
Well, the Queen, the
The
Queen can,
Queen in England can dissolve the entire government.
yes,
Never has,
and
never
she should.
tried to, never does anything untoward with regards to elections, whether they go for, against, whether the media is pro or against, whether the world is pro or against, never goes against Donald Trump visiting, even though the whole country goes nuts, at least in the media. The truth is that these monarchs don't exert that type of power. Now, if you want to discuss why they might work better in constitutional monarchs, where there's democracy, but there's this kind of sort of supposed power the monarch holds, well, we can discuss that as a more psychological concept of why people don't really, have more faith in the system, perhaps, if it's not only invested in people you vote for, but is also invested in, the people who were put there by God.
Yeah, and for those who believe monarchy is great, explain Swaziland to me, because that's an absolute monarchy and it's a bit shit. But yes, Jonathan, on to the next topic, if you do have one at hand.
Yeah, I do. Actually, there was a point earlier. Someone asked about what we thought about the China US supposed trade war. I don't think we're at the point of a war yet, although I would call what happened last week with regards to Huawei an escalation. I think those of you who follow me on Twitter will have seen that I agreed with and retweeted something that Kanthan Pillay had put out with regards to the imbalance of trade and the imbalance of how companies are able to do business in China. There's a lot of mockery of Donald Trump because Donald Trump talks about trade deficits and how the US has this massive trade deficit with China and it's not fair. And Ben Shapiro makes this argument where he says, well, when you go to the grocery store and you buy your groceries, when you walk out, you then have a trade deficit with the grocery store. But that's not actually a problem. But I do think that people choose to ignore the fact that China has for years flouted rules around trade. They've messed with their currency and manipulated it so that they could stay dominant in manufacturing. Um, some of you will be old enough to remember when China was not the manufacturing hub of the world. They manufactured some stuff, but Taiwan manufactured a lot of stuff. Japan manufactured a lot of stuff. The reality, Germany as well. The reality is that China has manipulated a lot of things and have been allowed to do this because it has been somewhat beneficial to the world. The other point that was made by Kanthan was that he went to China and he turned on his phone and he was unable to use Gmail and he was unable to use Google Maps and he was unable to use the Maps app on an Apple phone. And so he was unable to use all of these things because if you're Apple, you're allowed to sell your phone in China, but you're not allowed to use any American software. And this is the kind of marketplace that China runs. And, because the capitalists will sell anything to anyone, they're like, okay, well, if you don't want the software, cool, take the hardware then. But the reality is there's a massive trade imbalance that has been going on with China. I don't think Trump is entirely wrong on that, even though I have repeatedly said on the show that I do not agree with tariffs, the way he has done them. I don't agree with tariffs at all. I think there should be free trade regardless across the world. But there are tariffs. There are tariffs on America.
We finally have competition in the tech space, Jonathan Witt. We the ones who've been moaning about, these so-called social justice activists at these large tech firms that deplatform people and close their bank accounts and do all sorts of nefarious things on rules that are not obvious or defined. So I think Huawei has a real opportunity here to create an alternative operating system for cell phones that could be much better than Android at this stage. And as far I saw some reports that said that they're really well on their way to developing it. It's out in October, and it's already 60% faster than Android, apparently. So for once, China actually has to create something new rather than just bloody well stealing it from somewhere else. So I think it's a great opportunity for Huawei to actually be innovative and create something that competes with the big tech players in the world.
Yeah, look, I think that's an interesting view. I think that's fair. in terms of competition. Competition is good. I'll be interested to see if Huawei will go there, because they will essentially have to develop products for the international community that they refuse to develop for their own citizens. Remember, Huawei is basically a Chinese company, however way you spin it. They have a whole bunch of shareholdings, which are basically through shell companies that are held by the Chinese government and by Chinese ministers. But essentially, it's a Chinese company. And yeah, I think that could be interesting. And if they go that way, that could actually swing a couple of things in China. It could force them to liberalize some of their technology inadvertently. That said, I have yet to see China ever step up and create. They are very good at copying. They are very good at being given designs and plans or reverse engineering products that already exist. But, they tried with WeChat as an example. WeChat was WhatsApp re-engineered. It's not a bad app, but it's not as good as WhatsApp. They've got their own Facebook, but it's never spread out of China. That may be a choice, but as far as I understand, it's also not as good an app. So let's see. I think you're right on the competition side, but I do worry about the fact that China does hold ideology above all, and that often hinders their ability to create.
Yeah, well, China is in the stage where Japan was in the 60s and 70s. Also, a lot of knockoff products, terribly produced products, terrible quality. And now Japan's like the leading, country in terms of technology. I think Sony's based there. They make a lot of things in Japan, much better than other things, and much better than any other country. Toyota, the biggest car brand in the world, whereas 40 years ago, Toyota was seen as the sort of, I don't know, some cheap Japanese knockoff. So we will see. I think the political situation in China actually prevents them from actually being innovative. There's far too many restrictions on speech, far too many restrictions on what people are allowed to do, and especially that social credit score, which is completely Orwellian. But that sort of Google has sort of adopted anyway, in a sense, and Twitter as well.
I,
So
I, I need to make one other point, which people may not be aware of, but this Huawei thing doesn't come out of nowhere. And if you're not a big fan of Donald Trump, it really doesn't have that much to do with Donald Trump. In fact, for several months now, many Western countries have been debating whether to use Huawei technology in their 5G networks, which are being established. And that's the next big step up in terms of mobile communication technology, video conferencing, all that type of stuff. And excuse me, the problem is that because Huawei is Chinese government owned, and because China have been known to hide basically spyware or spy chips into the technology they sell other countries and other consumers, there's been a lot of controversy. So Australia has already banned 5G from Huawei from being used in their 5G network. This was a big ongoing debate in the past 2 months in the UK of whether Huawei was going to be allowed to be used in their 5G network. Canada's having similar debates. So the reality is that Huawei is considered to be a security concern by the Western world. And yes, this does fit neatly into Donald Trump's trade war, but it's not as simple as that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Agree with you on that. None of the stuff is very simple, but I'm glad it's happening. I like the chaos. Yeah, in the world order. It gives me a bit of hope that everything will crumble down, and we'll find out that we're not actually that great as human beings. Last topic. In the chat, please post some questions if you do. Jonathan, South Africa. The inauguration was made. The winning gangster is our president. What do you foresee? I personally don't see much. I think yes, the reduced cabinet, maybe the sugar tax will be stopped or repealed, but I see he signed the carbon tax in today, so probably not. I don't see much change happening in the next 5 years, and I think that people should get armed, buy Bitcoin, and build forts and communes around the country, and just trade with the world essentially in digital stuff. But yeah, I don't see South Africa going anywhere very quickly.
Yeah, so I posted that video of the paratrooper flying into the mortar cannon, and I think that is really symbolic of where the country is at the moment. We are on a constant decline, and at some point we're going to knock our heads against something very hard and knock ourselves out. I think that much of the talk that's happening at the moment is very much typical South African mediocrity. So if Cyril goes from 35 or 34 cabinets, departments, and which each have a cabinet minister and a deputy cabinet minister, if he drops that to 28, Eusebius Makaza will wet himself. And EWN will report it as a great stride forward, and the Bruce doctrine will continue. But the reality is that it shouldn't drop to 28, it should drop to 15, maybe less. He needs to make actual changes that affect people on the ground, that affect the economy directly, that are almost visible the minute he signs those things into law. You talk about repealing the sugar tax. Our sugar industry has been really hit badly and hard by the sugar tax. As I've mentioned on the show before, the actual change in obesity is negligible. So there will be no improvement in health as a result of the sugar tax, and
No,
we'll kill our sugar industry.
let's be serious. Who gives a fuck if people are fat? For fuck's sakes, it's not the government's job to determine people are too fat. I mean, the whole point of this tax is just funding the government. It's nothing to do with health and nothing to do with anything else. And they will destroy jobs and everything in its way to get more funding. There's a new fuel increase now thanks to the carbon tax, of which telecom represents 50% of all carbon emissions in South Africa. So you're going to tax not telecom, Eskom.
I was going to ask, how the hell is telecom doing that?
Are you going to tax fucking Eskom for all the carbon? No. You're going to tax some schmo who bought a fucking new BMW. How the fuck does that work? It's not there to solve problems. It's there because they cannot actually increase the income rate or VAT anymore. So they're finding these ancillary taxes for people who buy new things or who like sugar. That is it. It is a scheme. It's fraudulent and it's all bullshit. So whenever the government says they're here to solve a problem, that's bullshit.
Well, you'll get no argument from me on that. Taxation is theft. But the excuse that's often used is the government involves themselves in all parts of people's lives that it shouldn't involve themselves in. Healthcare is a great example. If the government doesn't provide healthcare, then the government can't say anything about your health. But the minute they do involve themselves in healthcare, then they do want to say something about your health. So because they pay for the healthcare of about 45 million South Africans, they think that they have a right to say what you should eat and drink and smoke and all the rest of it. And so they then justify these laws and they justify this theft through those means. And they're not the only government that does this. Our government is just getting particularly desperate to find new ways to fleece us.
Yeah, and expect that to continue. And I think Cyril's right on that train. We are just beavers waiting to be shorn. Is that the correct word? Skinned, shorn? I don't know. The fur, they want the fur, not the meat underneath. And we are just the meat for the moment. And the fur is our taxes. Do you think the Rand will tank? I don't know. I can't make predictions.
I think the Rand, I've had a long-standing opinion on this, which is that the Rand will slowly get worse and worse. It will have moments where it dips. So we've seen this before. It went from 8 to 10, and then it recovers to like 9-ish, and then it goes back up to 10.50, and everyone kind of readjusts and just accepts. It did that again, 10 to 12, 13. It had that run where it went all the way, I think, to 14 or so, and then recovered to like 12. So yeah, I think you're just going to see that happen again and again and again until one day you look up and it's at 100, and you're like, wow, what happened? So that's what I think the trajectory of the Rand is.
Yeah, unless they do EWC in a violent manner, then
Oh
you'd
yeah,
expect
yeah.
hyperinflation overnight. Who do you want to see the leader of the DA? I don't actually care about the DA at all anymore. I'm actually very tired of them. I think that they have shot the bolt. I think that they will be irrelevant in 10 years. However, I don't think the VF Plus is going to take over as the official opposition. I think the EFF will, if nothing changes for now. So to me, I mean, the DA will do well, I think, with John Steenhuisen perhaps as leader, or he's the only one that comes to mind, if I'm really honest. People within the DA now, he's the only one that comes to mind. I know
So
Zachary Mbele is great, but
nah, you all the wrong people.
I don't think he'll want to become a leader, so to speak. He's very good at what he does, but he's not. I don't think he would want to become a leader. Michael Cardo,
So
neither.
so
I think only John Steenhuisen, perhaps.
nah. Look, I think there's several people in the DA who, if you're a thinker, if you really want to sit down and think about what would improve the country and what would truly make things better, um, and you're assuming this party can get into power or be a very strong opposition, or enter into coalitions, then you're thinking, people like John Steenhuisen, you're thinking perhaps someone like Zakele Mbele, you're thinking perhaps of the Michael Cardos, Gav Davis, who left, Gwenya, I mean, that goes without saying. But the reality is I think if the DA wants any hope in hell of moving anywhere, and I'm not his biggest fan, but Herman Mashaba. That's how the DA goes forward. They make that man leader, and I think they go places. I really think they go places. I think they will
Actually,
piss a
that's
lot of
actually very,
people off,
yeah.
but I think that they will turn a lot of people on. I think he's Trumpian in a way, and he doesn't apologize for his opinions. He's pissed people off because he is anti illegal immigration, but he says it in a very sort of unkind way. He comes across as xenophobic sometimes, and he
Well,
doesn't give a
he's
shit.
truthful. I mean, come on. He tells the
Um,
truth for the most part.
yeah, look, I mean, the reality is the facts. We've spoke about it on the show before. He released facts that showed 40% of people attending Johannesburg clinics are foreigners who are in the country illegally. So that's 40% of the funding to all clinics in Johannesburg go to foreigners. And he's going, well, maybe that's not a great thing, given the facts, the state of our country, the state of our health system, etc., etc. And he says that around everything. So I think he's the kind of guy who's willing to take a stand on certain things. I think he's got an ear to the ground of what sort of could be almost a populist DA, which could steal votes away from the EFF, but not be a leftist party.
Mm.
And I think that would be a stroke of genius on the part of the DA, but who knows?
Yeah, he sort of has a tinge of national populism, and I think that will go quite well in a country like ours, which is highly nationalistic. So yeah, that's actually a good point. So yeah, perhaps Helen Mashaba would be the ideal candidate for the DA, not because he has the principles of the DA that we sort of used to like, but because perhaps he suits South Africa very well. Jonathan, are you ever going to leave the country? Is another question. I would leave once they start taking land by hook or by crook, on a scale that is not just, how can I explain, surgical. But I think once you give an inch, they'll take the whole arm anyway. So I think once EWC is a real thing, and all the legal things are exhausted, and maybe there's still time like to fight physically in terms of protecting land with guns and things like that. Maybe I'll stay for that because that's a hell of a lot of fun. Um, but after that, yeah, I mean, after that, yeah, I don't think there's any point in staying here at all.
Yeah, I've long said on the show repeatedly that if you have the opportunity to leave, you should leave, based on your prospects somewhere else being better. If you are leaving here to move to the Congo, then maybe not. But if your opportunity is to move to a country that is more civilized in terms of a lower crime rate, in terms of more peace and prosperity for your family, less race-based policies. Certainly, if you're a white male, for example, and you want to get into certain degrees or certain jobs, you need to consider these things. And would I ever consider it? Absolutely, I would. If the opportunity was there and I was able to, sure. I just saw someone asked what I think my opinion on the healthcare of MJ. I don't know who MJ is. Michael Jackson was a very sick man, and he shouldn't have taken so much propofol. That's my opinion.
And you shouldn't have fiddle kitties. Fuck's sake, Jonathan. That's the first thing you should say. God.
Damn it! I forgot about the fiddling kitties part. That's a side effect of propofol.
Yeah. Yeah, don't do that. Let me just see. All right, there's not many more questions here. Basically, reactionary opinions. Reactionary opinions are it's a trio of people who are like some of the oldest listeners on Renegade Reports. So go to YouTube, go to Reactionary Opinions, subscribe to the channel. They're reactionary, they're far right. In some ways, they like monarchy, and I quite like their show. So a free plug to you, Reactionary Opinions. I won't say your names out in public because maybe you don't want them to be out in public like this. So let me see here.
And then while you're plugging, I'm on North-South podcast on Sunday evening. So anyone who wants to tune in there, I'm sure they'll advertise on their platforms. But I'm
sorry, I'm watching Ronaldo's Sunday debate.
Are you watching Ronaldo?
Maybe I'll be on it. Who knows? For like
maybe you will.
Time.
Maybe you will be on with Ronaldo. But if you're bored of Ronaldo, then you are welcome to watch myself and the guys at North-South podcast.
How can you be bored of a centrist?
I don't know, Ramon. You know, they're just so centrist that one never gets bored, really, of walking in the middle of the road.
We should talk about centrism. I think it's possibly the worst thing you can be. It's like sort of those fat American women who watch Oprah and think that, I don't know, like they're doing good for the world by watching Oprah.
I'm not following your analogy.
Inspirational. No, that's what centrism is. It's milk toast, vanilla, boring, and basically you will accept slavery if there is slavery in the world that you live in. That's what centrism means to me. There's nothing radical about you. There's nothing subversive. There's nothing fun.
You're straw manning a little bit now.
It's accepting what is in front of you, and that is the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, look, I think that centrism is sometimes seen as the compromise. It's not black, it's not white, it's sort of the grey area, and it's sort of sit in the grey area.
Jonathan, the stench of appeasement. That's what centrism is.
Ramon, I'm not a centrist. I'm just trying to steel man them a little bit, given that you just compared them to fat women watching Oprah.
Well, they do. Someone says centrism is a foreskin, worthless. That's unfair. I still have one. One of us.
That does make one of us, yes. Right.
So here's the interesting question before you go. Do you think SACP will continue to drive economic policy in the new administration? Now, this is something interesting because it does appear that horrible ogre, Rob Davies, and that other horrible gnome, Ibrahim Patel, are out of the cabinet. And that is huge. But we'll need to see who replaces them, because if you had to blame anyone, as Franz said, so the looters and the SACP combined to get rid of the neoliberal Thabo Mbeki. And what they did was the looters looted, and then the SACP created communist policy, essentially, that tagged the economy and fucked everything up. If the SACP, however, Ramaphosa got the blessing of the SACP to become president, he did. What are they expecting in return, the SACP? If not cabinet positions. So I'm a little bit suspicious that Rob Davies and Ibrahim Patel are out, but who is going to control finance, trade and industry, and what the other one did, international trade or something? I can't remember. So eyes on the ball, but I think the SACP has been the policy engine of the ANC since 1961, and I don't think that will change anytime soon.
I think you need to be very careful of listening to any of the spin you're hearing at the moment with regards to these cabinet announcements, with what's going to happen later in this week. Maybe if you're listening to this podcast later in the week and it has been announced, I'm willing to bet that almost all of the conjecture turns out to be partly incorrect. I think the cabinet might shrink a little bit, not much. I think you'll find that if he excludes Rob Davies, he still includes Ibrahim Patel. And if he excludes both of those, he includes other people who are just as bad or cut from the same cloth. He puts Rob Davies into the presidency, for example, and that's not any more helpful than having him in a department. Because you then have a communist whispering in the ear of the president and to all the president's friends. So I'm not convinced. If I'm wrong, and I hope I am, and that he gets rid of all these guys, then we may have an interesting time ahead of us. But as Ramon says, you got policy that's been sitting in those books for 70 years. It's ANC manifesto for 70 years. To change that and to remove that from who the party is an incredible long shot.
Yeah, especially with the prescribed assets and shit like that, where they force your pension to buy like Eskom shares and bonds and shit like that. So that has the fingerprints of the NDR all over it. And I wouldn't discount the fact that the SACP will take a very active role in policy production going forward. They may not have ministries, but behind the scenes, I'm sure that, they will remain quite a powerful force, and I wouldn't underestimate them at all.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I also think, once again, you need to remember where Cyril Ramaphosa comes from. These people are his friends. These people are who he grew up with. These people are who he basically studied politics together with. And yeah, I think it's unlikely. Your best hope in South Africa currently is that we end up moving towards sort of where we were during the Mbeki times, which was still on the left, still doing stupid things, but kind of not fucking with the private sector too much. If we can sort of go back to that, it'll be a win. It's not really where we should be, and it's not as successful as we could be, but it's a start.
Yep. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen watching, thank you so much. For those who are listening and not sure what we're talking about, this has been a live show on YouTube. We try to do these once a month. So follow us on YouTube, link in the show notes, and you will be able to see us once a month. So before we go, please buy our shit in our store, renegadereport.co.za/shop. And also, please support the show. We get no money. It's actually a loss for us because we spend money getting around and spend money on the studio stuff and equipment, and we don't make any money from the show at all. And we would like this to be a real big show. But we need funding. So corporates won't fund us. NGOs won't fund us. No one will fund us. And I think we prefer it that way. Advertisers won't help us out either. So we're relying on you. Find people. 50 Rand a month, 100 Rand a month. The average now is 62 Rand a month. And we've got a few people donating. But if you can, please donate. renegadereport.co.za/support-us. And we really appreciate everyone who does that, because the only way the show grows is with money. And we do this for free, but we care about the ideas. We care about the show. We care about the listeners. And yeah, if you can help us out, cheers. Look after yourself first, of course. If you've got a bit of cash at the end of the month, pop it our way. We will appreciate it.
Yeah, as always, there's Ramon's very sad moment of begging. Thank you, as always, for listening.
It's called e-begging.
This is where I mute you usually. And as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, both the show and us. Thanks, as always, for coming by and watching, if you've been watching, and thank you to you for downloading. Remember, we are on a new feed. Make sure you download off the new feed. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Cheers.